Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to economist, business owner, and United States congressional candidate Tim Reichert about effective philanthropy and the erosion of the American middle class. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on May 18th, 2022 in dry as dust, Phoenix, Arizona, where we can't wait for the summer rains to arrive, if they arrive. God help us, they will arrive this year. And I am happy to have as our guest today another Westerner, Tim Reichert, founder and CEO of Economics Partners and candidate for Congress in the 7th District of Colorado. Tim Reichert lives in Golden, Colorado, with his wife, Martha. He was formerly a partner at both Ernst & Young and Duff & Phelps. I'll let him tell a little more of his life story here in a little bit. But I will note that he has a doctorate in economics from George Mason University. And I suspect that much of our conversation today will revolve around that discipline because Tim has a very interesting take on some very significant economics data for the last 100 years or so, especially in the last 50 years. Tim and his wife, Martha, work with the homeless through their support and participation in the mission of Christ in the City and Missionaries of Charity. They have both served on the board of Endow, and Martha served as president of that Catholic women's organization. Tim currently serves on the board of St. John Vianney Seminary, and Martha serves on the board of Thomas Aquinas College, the Augustine Institute, Endow, and Creatio. I think I'm saying that correctly. Tim Reichert, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, Jeremy. Great to be here.
And did I say it correctly?
You did. You nailed it. Yes. Creatio.
All right. Well, I didn't have any Latin in school as a public school Protestant kid from Indiana. A few of the propers and hymns in Latin in church have fixed me up a little bit.
Good for you.
Well, it's great to have you on, Tim. You fit all three of the categories that we talk about on this podcast. You're a giver, you're definitely a doer, and you're definitely a thinker. So we're going to hit on all those things. So we're going to start I want to start on the giving side because it's one of the harder things for us to do on this podcast is to have people on lots of people are very generous with their giving and are great hearts and, have sort of a virtuous generosity about them, but not many are very articulate about their giving or necessarily are very self-reflective about it. I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little bit about that, but first, just a little bit more about you. Where did you grow up? I know you're not from Colorado originally, and how did you get interested in economics?
Oh, let's see. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up south of a town called Sandusky, Ohio, a little town called Norwalk, and it's kind of on the edge of the Midwestern Rust Belt. And I grew up in the 70s, so kind of a time of stagflation. And I tell the story of kind of how I got introduced to economics. I'll never forget it. It happened at the grocery store. My dad took me down the canned goods aisle, and he had me. My dad was a great teacher. He had me reach to the back of the shelf to get a can of beans, and he said, "So what's the sticker price on there?" It was like 39 cents. And I said, "So what's the price on these beans at the front of the shelf?" Because those days, push the older inventory to the back of the shelf and just put the new inventory at the front. It was like 42 cents or something like that. He said, "So this is inflation." He said, "Because of some things that the government is doing, prices are rising, and they're rising faster than people's wages." And that had a profound effect on me. I spent time, about the same time in my life, working in fields with migrant workers in the summers to earn a little bit of extra money. My brother Greg and I worked at a place called Boose's Farm Market. And we'd get there at like 6:30 in the morning, and we'd work until noon or 1, maybe 1:30, depending upon what we were picking that day. And we were getting like 25 cents a quart to pick strawberries, and that was constant the whole time, didn't change. And again, this is the stagflationary 70s. And, meanwhile, the prices of foodstuffs were rising. And I remember what it was like to see guys and men and women who they didn't own anything. They had no assets, right? All they had to
Right.
sell was their labor. And what a profound effect it had on me to see, these folks who, I remember it distinctly toward the end of that period, were increasingly having to eat in the fields because, they were eating part of what they were picking in order to sustain themselves. And so, that those things really had a profound effect on me. That they're a big part of the reason I became an economist, and a big part of the reason why I have a heart for the middle class, because that's where it came from.
So you went to George Mason. We went to Steubenville Franciscan University, I think, for your undergrad, and George Mason University for your PhD. From there, you went on to work. To maybe talk a little bit about your career and what you did. I know you've talked about and something else that I've either talked to you about or read. I can't remember now. That part of what you did that you sort of regret now is helping. What's it called? Value supply. Basically outsourcing jobs to China. I forget what the euphemism was.
Yeah, value chain analysis. So I remember. So I was a partner at Ernst & Young for a time. I led their economics practice for a chunk of the West. And this was early in my career. I was in my late 20s and early 30s, and I was sort of a freshly minted PhD. Kind of bought into trade theory, the so-called Heckscher-Ohlin model, which was sort of the standard trade model, the neoclassical trade model, which says that countries specialize in producing the thing for which they have a comparative advantage, and you're going to displace some labor and some capital when you do that, but they're going to get reallocated into sectors where they've got a higher and better use. And so I would participate in these projects that were called value chain analyses, and you'd see on the spreadsheets and the models of how this was going to look. You'd see things like FTE equivalents that could be cut here in the U.S. And as I've said, I'm embarrassed today to say that I participated in that. At the time, my thinking as I said, freshly minted economist was that, this is how economic growth happens. And now I realize, and in part because of the research that guys like David O'Toole at MIT have done, that so many of those people who lost their jobs because we shipped our manufacturing base to China never got back on the economic ladder. It is a tragedy of gigantic proportions. Some of the work that O'Toole and others have done shows a direct causal relationship between exposure to China and the opioid crisis, for example. I mean, what are we doing here, right? I mean, we shipped all these jobs to China for cheaper stuff, for so-called efficiency, but as I say now, we have to remember efficiency is not God. There's a debt of loyalty that we owe to our fellow citizens and to the American work.
We'll come back to more of this on the economics questions. I have a bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about. And I know that's sort of the center of your platform for Congress is, I think you call it your Middle Class Restoration Act, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yep. Middle Class Restoration Plan. Yeah, that's right.
Plan. I'm sorry. Yeah. And anybody who's interested can go to Reichert for Congress.com. I think REICHERT for Congress.com and read it. It's all right there. It's very different than what you might typically read. I'll say that right now from a platform of anybody running for a major political party in the United States. Much more detailed and thoughtful and clear and less BS-y. I'll say that. You may pay a price for that at the polls. I hope not. I hope that it redounds to your benefit.
Yeah, I think it will. And thank you for your kind remarks. I think it will redound to my benefit. Voters here in Colorado, I think, is thrilled to the idea that we've got a Republican who's not just saying he's for the middle class, but has sort of spent the kind of time that I did developing a plan to restore it. So it's working pretty well so far.
Good. And I'll talk to you more about that too. But before you became a candidate for Congress, which is just obviously you're in your first go right now, we're still in the primary season as we're reporting here, and you have obviously competitors for in that primary. But before you did that, and before you came up with this middle class restoration plan, you've been a giver. You've been active on boards and as a donor to a number of organizations. And so I thought I'd ask you a little bit about that. First of all, what led you to kind of have that kind of commitment to your giving where you don't just give, you serve on a number of organizations' boards? And maybe you can talk about a little bit what you've learned from your experience on those boards about oh gosh, how good boards work and how bad boards work, how good nonprofits work, how bad nonprofits work. If you're a guy who tends to list things. You have come up with a list of things you've learned in that experience as a board member.
I'd be happy to, sure. So, I think a lot about this distinction that Mother Teresa makes between Christian charity and social. She would say all the time, I'm not a social worker. And that's a really important point, right? I mean, her point was, look, there's a big difference between the allocation of dollars, right? The allocation of capital and changing the human heart. And there's one way to change the human heart, and that is through grace, right? And so she was very clear that she and her nuns, her order, were not social workers. They were there to be Jesus Christ to those that they encountered. And think about how efficient, to speak as an economist, think about how efficient her order, the Missionaries of Charity, has been. It's unbelievable how much they have done with so little. It's truly a miracle. And so that has always been an inspiration to me. Martha and I have spent a lot of time, as you say, on boards, doing our philanthropic efforts, or exerting our philanthropic efforts, but primarily in the Catholic space, because we're Catholic.
Right.
And Mother Teresa has been our inspiration. We really believe that that charity is, in fact, very different from social work because of the connection to grace. You putting those two things together is like pouring gasoline on a fire, right? You can have a fire and maybe it's going, maybe it's like about to blow out or about to snuff out. But with the addition of grace, it's like putting gas on that fire. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you see the transformation of people's lives in a way that you don't through just straight social work. I mean, we've been allocating trillions, in fact, of dollars as a country over decades to all kinds of social efforts. But where you see it pay off is in context where you can actually change the human heart, and that happens as a result of grace. So that's how we kind of got in, and it also, Go ahead. You were going to ask a question, Jeremy.
Well, I want to, before you go on, because I asked you a lot of things, but I want to just stop on that for a second. So, as a board member who thinks these things, who believes the things that you just talked about, how do you try to arrest any slide towards social work kind of thinking, for lack of a better term, on the nonprofits you sat in, or how do you continue to sort of assess effectiveness, the sorts of things that board members are traditionally supposed to do, without sliding into that sort of social work, mentality that doesn't take grace into account?
Yeah. Well, your question is exactly where I was going to go. So there have been boards. Yeah, we're thinking alike. So there have been boards that I've said no to, and I'm not going to name them, but some of them are very large and very Catholic, and I've had conversations with the folks at the heads of those organizations, and one of the things I've said is, look, I feel like you're selling your charity cheap. I feel like all through history, Christian churches have connected charity and evangelization. And I think increasingly Christian churches have divorced those two things. And it's made both worse. And by both, I mean both the charity and the evangelization, right? So that's a huge part of it is what are the boards you select? And I think a tilt toward evangelization and a tilt toward charity in that context is number one. And then how do you sort of prevent the slide toward a sort of bureaucratic social work mentality? I don't know that there's a kind of secret sauce there other than being watchful. The motto or the phrase I have used, which I just used a moment ago, let's not sell our charity for cheap. And
Right.
look, I think here we can even take a cue from folks on the progressive left, right? I mean, these are folks with
Hmm.
whether they know it or not, kind of a Marxian bent, and I think they do a very good job of coupling a kind of ideological evangelization with their charitable efforts, and yet
Right.
we on the, let's say, Catholic side, where I come from, uh, you know, we Christianity generally built Western civilization, and here we are all too often divorcing the soul and the development of virtue from from charity, from what used to be Christian.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's an interesting contrast you just draw there. I have met a number of Catholic leaders who are really not nonprofit leaders who are really good people who are um, seem to understand their faith as simply supposed to be motivate them as a motivating factor in what they do, but is not as a penetrating or permeating factor in the fear of the fear seems to be that they would be won't be inclusive enough, that they'd be felt up that they don't serve everybody, like
Yep.
which we see is obviously not the case with someone like Mother Teresa, or that they don't want to proselytize and turn people away or turn people off. But as you point out, I think it's very smart. It's like, well, actually, the more your faith sort of permeates everything you do, the more effective you'll actually be in the social work sort of dimension of what you do, not just in the faith dimension.
Yeah, and not just you as a social worker / evangelist, but also the folks that you're trying to help, right? Um, there's a close connection, I would argue causal, between the development of human virtues and the action of grace, right? I mean, how could there not be,
Right.
right? If anything that we believe is true, that must be true.
Yeah. How's your how do you select then the sort of as a giver, thinking of that hat on now, the organizations um, you support versus the ones you decline to support? Is it that Mother Teresa like understanding of what they're doing that's most important to you? Or are you looking for groups that are do you try to quantify their effectiveness as a giver or have some sort of metric that you look at? As a leadership, what are you looking at when you're or is it just gut feel? Like you're just going where your heart leads you?
No, so it's a few things. Number one, where can I actually help? Right, there are some boards that are just loaded with extremely talented individuals, and the incremental value of my time or my wife's time is small, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's part of it. And I will say, my wife is a far better board member than I am, which is why she's on a lot more boards. Uh, but
I
she
noticed.
she she's amazing. But I think we have a tilt toward some smaller organizations that we think have very big potential. So you mentioned Creatio at the outset. I mean, that's an organization based in
Mm-hmm.
Denver. It's very small, growing very rapidly, very focused on the way in which beauty is probably the last of the triad that modern or postmodern souls respond to, right? Truth, beauty, and goodness. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure that truth really resonates with a lot of folks. It does, of course, by definition, but
Right.
truth, beauty, and goodness. The one I think that is most interesting to the most people is beauty, and so beauty as a mode of evangelization is really what they're all about. Small organization. It's an organization where, because of that, I think there's a kind of higher sort of marginal value of our time. So that's
Right.
an example. Then education. My wife serves on the board of a college, well-known Catholic liberal arts great books program, and an institute here in Denver, because we think that in the same way that beauty matters, truth matters, but truth to convey it well is very hard in a world that is so full of noise, right? And so
Right.
picking kind of a place like a Thomas Aquinas College is sort of for us at least a smart move. I think some of it is also just personal relationships. A good friend of mine was asked a long time ago, hey, why did you decide to become a Catholic? And he said, because somebody asked, and you know, and so that's part of it too, just sort of personal
Yeah.
relationships.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so some of it is that it's just kind of happenstance and relationships.
Well, your answer there, especially on education, leads me to our next topic, I think. But I'm going to wait for that until after we come back from a break, talk a little bit of practicalities. We will, therefore, be right back with Tim Reichert. Back in a moment. All right, time for a practicality. And today, happy to have with us somebody who's not from American Philanthropic, but from one of our partners in this nonprofit space, a firm called Innovest. And man's name is Rich Todd, the founder, principal, and CEO at Innovest. How are you doing today, Rich?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. You have a lot of expertise in an area in which we have none. Certainly, I have none, which is doing investment-related consulting for nonprofit organizations, family offices, even retirement plans, and some families. It's a really interesting topic because if you're a nonprofit leader, whether you're on the foundation side or the charity side, you probably have some funds to manage, at least if you've reached a certain size. And a lot of questions come with that. How do you do it well and wisely? So maybe we can start with a question that is one that you're very interested in, which is the values question. How important is it for a nonprofit to be investing in a way that aligns with its values?
Thanks, Jeremy. I think that it is up to that nonprofit on a case-by-case basis. What we find in a lot of cases is advisors come into organizations and they're really trying to get them to invest in their values. Mm-hmm. And it's really important for the nonprofit organization to focus on what they care about. And for some nonprofit organizations, it's about just getting the best returns that they can so that they can give more money away or they can fulfill their mission. And in other cases, especially with religious organizations, they don't want to be investing in securities that are contrary to what they believe. Right. And so therefore, we believe that we should go through an exercise of determining what that is. And then we can go through a process of helping them make sure that their portfolio is in accordance with their values.
How hard is it for an organization with that sort of profile, that sort of commitments, to get their portfolio aligned? Is that a difficult process to go through or not so difficult?
I would say the larger the organization, the easier it is. But the good news for smaller organizations is it is getting easier. And there are many investment products, many investment managers that are able to customize a portfolio that are in accordance with values of, let's say, religious organizations, Christian, Catholic. And so that universe is broadening.
What percentage, your estimate, I know this is just an out of the blue question, but of faith-based organizations like that, what percentage of them that have investment advisors, that have a firm like yours helping them, what percentage of them are concerned about this question or actually acting on that concern? Is it a fairly low percentage or is it a fairly high percentage?
I would say it's a fairly high percentage, but I think in some cases they believe that they're getting values-based investing. And in some cases they are investing in securities in companies that are really contrary to what they care about. And today there's a lot of talk about ESG investing, environmental, social governance. And in some cases, if you're a religious organization and you're concerned about let's say, pornography or abortion, you may certainly be investing in some of those companies that are involved or engaged in that area.
I'm sure that's the case, and I'm sure that's why it's very important to have an investment advisor that is aligned with you. What about investment committees? That's something you've mentioned to me before. What is an investment committee? When do you form one if you're a nonprofit, and what does it do?
Well, normally we would recommend that when you have assets to invest, that a board or a finance director, a CFO, delegate that responsibility to an investment committee that has some background and expertise in investing, maybe personal investing or nonprofit investing. I do believe that there is a benefit in having a variety of expertise on that investment committee that could include maybe people that are their own businesses in the, let's say, wealth management business, to CPAs can be very helpful in the way that they think about investing, and they think about spending and development, and that can be really important when you're designing your objectives. So we can help organizations think about how to construct an investment committee that is can perform great work for any organization.
What is that relationship? You just mentioned your spending policy, your development efforts. How do those play into these questions about how you should be invested with your assets?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when we're hired, often the first question I ask is, why is your portfolio designed the way it is? And it is, often that they can't tell me the reason. And what we believe generally is that if you are an organization that spends a lot from that portfolio, that is a formula to have conservative objectives. If you are adding money to the portfolio, if your development is really strong, if you've hired American Philanthropic to help
Thanks for the ad, Rich. Appreciate that.
To grow your fund, whether it's operating cash or a foundation or endowment, if you're successful there, that is a formula to be more aggressive. And we go through a process of quantifying not just what that return objective should be, but also what that downside risk tolerance could be, so that if your time frame is short and if your risk tolerance is low, you need to make sure that portfolio is designed to be low risk.
How big should a nonprofit be? And what's the right metric? Is it assets? Is it annual fundraising before they're engaging an advisor like you guys?
Well, often we're hired to manage an existing portfolio, but we're often hired in the event of, let's say, a major gift campaign or some sort of capital campaign where they know they're going to have some money to invest. That's when we're engaged. And donors want to make sure that the organizations that they support are good stewards.
Right.
And so we're part of what we do is we help as a co-fiduciary, we help the donor understand that they are a good fiduciary, they are a good steward, and at the same time, they can meet those goals, those investment goals.
Makes a ton of sense. Rich Todd, innovestinc.com. That's INNOVESTINC.com. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been great to be with you.
All right, we are back with business owner, economist, and U.S. congressional candidate Tim Reichert. And we have been talking a little bit about his philanthropy and his view of charity. I should say charity, not philanthropy. It's a distinction I think Tim probably agrees with me on. You've been talking about the distinction between charity and social work. I talk about the distinction between charity and philanthropy along the exact same lines. Yep. But let's shift now towards what we started to touch on at the beginning of this conversation, which is economics to the American economy, perhaps we should say, the state of the American middle class. I know you're running for Congress precisely because You're concerned about the state of the American middle class. How would you characterize its status now? And what data points to you have been really sort of clarifying for showing just what the problems are that the middle class and especially rising young people are facing today?
Yeah. So I guess the word that I would use is beleaguered and shrinking. So the American middle class. I talk a lot on the campaign trail about the difference between the 1970s and now, right? In a lot of ways, very similar, right? Inflation, kind of a low or slow growth economy, trouble at the southern border, trouble with Russia, right? So all kinds of similarities. But the difference is that in the 70s, we walked into that moment, that time of challenge, with a very strong American middle class, which, I follow a guy named Ed Wolfe. He's an economist who studies something called asset poverty. I think his definition of the middle class is exactly the right definition of the middle class. It's the middle 60% based upon ownership, the value of what you own.
Okay.
Why? Because that middle class in the 70s, they owned things, right? Homes, businesses, prospering main streets, trucks, tools, land, boats, whatever, you name it. It was an ownership society and an owning middle class. And today, we have this extreme asset inequality, this concentration of ownership on one side of the spectrum, and this non-ownership, this almost serfdom on the other. And the sort of the indicia of that. I mean, you could measure it directly, as Ed Wolfe has done. He's got a great book. Let me just look at my bookshelf here.
Sure.
A Century of Wealth in America is what it's called. It's a fantastic, thick tome, but it's a really good analysis of where we are from the standpoint of ownership in America, ownership of assets. But we got here for a number of reasons. So, some of those have to do with trade. David O'Toole at MIT has done some amazing work on what he calls the China shock, showing the way in which those trade models fail, and the way in which folks who lose those high value manufacturing jobs never get back on the economic ladder, or have not gotten back on the economic ladder.
Right.
Since we began this relationship with the Chinese economy. Is it Julius Wilson? No, William Julius Wilson.
William Julius Wilson, yeah.
Yes,
yep.
The great African American sociologist. His book When Work Disappears, right? So fundamental, right? So that's one sort of key indicator. Technology is another, right? So we've moved to a world in which, from which we had capital and labor that complemented one another. And yeah, sure, been kind of struggles between capital and labor all through our history and through the history of capitalism, but fundamentally, physical capital is the kind of capital we had, and it made labor more productive, right? So that's why wages rose.
Right.
Now, a larger and larger share of the capital that firms use is intangible capital, particularly in the form of software, and particularly in the form of automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Yeah. Which, if you think about it, by definition, that does not complement. In fact, it competes with labor. And so it pushes wages down by definition, right? So it's, the way that our policymakers often think of that is they're like, oh, good, it's deflationary. It keeps inflation down. Well, how does it do that? It does it by decreasing wages, right? So,
right.
so that's a big part of it. Monetary policy is another key sort of indicator, cause. So we've wound up in a place where, at least until really the last several months, interest rates were at 5,000-year lows. Think about that, 5,000-year lows. And that means that we've destroyed, it's incredible. We've destroyed thrift, right? So you can't get the value of compound, or the benefit rather of compound interest, which is so
you
powerful.
Can't save your way to prosperity in any way. It's a foreign idea now to people. You have to
Thank you.
spend.
That's a better way of saying it than I did, right? You can't save your way to prosperity. That's an awesome phrase. I'm going to steal that for the campaign trail. That's exactly right.
Please use it. I mean, it's a truth that I actually have used in my own life as a way of actually justifying risks, But it is actually, though, I think you call out rightly that it's socially, though, that's really not the situation we want, right?
Not at all.
It's weird. Yeah.
Yep. Not at all. And so much of this stems from kind of a shift in the way we think about economic policy that happened in around the 1940s, right? So World War II hits, we centralize the economy in a way we hadn't before. We begin to build out the administrative state in a very serious way. And economic policy shifts from, a kind of microeconomic focus on building strong households, right? Whether it was the 6 Homestead Acts that we had as a nation, not one, we had 6, or policies that very geared toward home ownership and creating incentives for home ownership, or creating incentives to build a manufacturing base. We had industrial policy.
Right.
We shifted from that to really economic policy being focused on almost exclusively on fiscal and monetary policy. So the idea is, the state is responsible just to kind of keep employment levels at a certain, at a certain level, and that's a very different conception of people. It's sort of a view that, look, these are all serfs. We just got to keep them employed and try to keep prices somewhat stable. But it lacks an idea of what human flourishing really is and what a happy, prosperous democracy looks like. A happy, prosperous middle class looks like.
You, I at one point, just to pause you for a second, and this probably goes back a little bit to the technology point. Not only does I think it's a really important and insightful point, by the way, because people will say, people are always complaining about new technologies, and look, we're fine. Everybody adapts and we're fine. No, nothing to worry about here. Self-driving trucks, automated robots, big deal. But I think it's a really insightful point. I just want to emphasize that this might be a fundamentally and intrinsically different moment with sort of when we're talking about capital being essentially sort of the source of technologies that replace labor rather than lead to more capital, which then calls forth the need for more labor and high price labor at that. Across the board.
It's right. We've always had something called labor saving innovation. There's always been capital that to some degree, saves on labor costs. But for the most part, because that capital was physical on net, it was very much complementary. It made labor more productive, raised wages, and grew the economy. Now it competes directly. I mean, that's what AI does. Yeah. AI is designed to do what you do in one way or another, depending upon the problem.
Right. And that's a whole different ball of wax, which we can talk about what to do about that. But the other thing you've mentioned about technology, computers, generally they've rewarded bigness in a way that previous maybe sort of capital innovations haven't so much. And so you have a graph you show, I think it's over the last, it's some 50-year period, maybe it's 72 to 2012 or something like that. I maybe have it wrong. You can tell me that large firms, 500 employees or more, have grown at a much faster rate than have a much higher internal rate of return. I don't remember exactly the metric than small and medium-sized firms. And that is because you think of the sort of scaling effects that are made possible by sort of computers. Digital technology. Do I have that right?
Totally. Yeah. I remember this, to go back to the conversation we had about my days at EY. I remember that was the time during which, sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe mid to late 90s, when the whole game for these now gigantic multinational corporations was to implement these ERP, enterprise resource planning software systems that allowed them to manage at a global scale in a way that was hitherto impossible. You could never have done it. But because of those sorts of systems, which are now far more sophisticated than they were, 25 years ago, there is an ability to manage across geography and across productive domains, meaning different types of products and services, that is just completely unheard of 25 years ago. And that has created economies of scope and scale that we never had before.
I stopped you. You've mentioned three or so of the variables you think have contributed to this erosion of the American middle class. So technology and this uncomplimentary labor, monetary policy you've touched on. What else would you say has, because I know it's an overdetermined thing, or at least I imagine that it is.
Yeah, it's a good way of saying it. I guess I would add, a couple things. One, I talk about complexity as discrimination. The Code of Federal Regulations stands at 200,000 pages, right? It's think about Thomas Aquinas and his definition of law, right? One of the necessary conditions for law to be law is it must be promulgated. And that just means stated and understood, right? Well, the Code of Federal Regulations ain't law, right? I mean, 200,000 pages, it's impossible for any human mind to contain or understand the CFR. Yeah. It's not possible. And so anyway, why do we have it then? Well, we have it in large part because large corporations have either lobbied for or actually directly written it. Why have they done that? Because they can buy market share, right? The cost of regulatory compliance is a fixed cost. And so if you're a GE or a Walmart or whatever, you can spread that fixed cost out over hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. And the little guy who wants to get into those markets can't. It's a barrier to entry. It's called raising your rival's costs, big economics literature on it. And that has, closed off a key pathway into the middle class, or at least largely closed it off, which is, small business. Think about the old sort of, built a business out of my garage, myth, right? Not that it was never true. It was, but it's almost a mythology in America. That is, to a large extent, no more because of the amount of regulatory constraint on the little guy. And that's not because governments just sort of did it. It's because, in large part, because large corporations lobbied for these things. And so, that's what does that do? It erodes the middle class. It erodes the middle class. It harms the little guy.
Another thing you've talked about that I think is really pertinent today, because I hear it a lot and I feel for them from my young colleagues, is housing shortages and how that has driven up home prices. And of course, home ownership was sort of the sine qua non of being a member of the American middle class, at least it used to be. And certainly is by your definition, talking about asset ownership as being sort of the key to being middle class. How big a role has that played?
A very big role. Right now, housing is thought of as an asset class, right? So it's easy to pick on Blackstone, right, because they're giant. But it's also, I think, fair to pick on Blackstone, right? They are going around buying, massive numbers of single-family homes. I have heard, this may or may not be true, but what I have heard is that, in some cases, entire neighborhoods, right? So what are we doing, right? The finance industry is becoming a perma-landlord, and it's looking. What does that look like? It looks like post-Victorian England, right, where you had a landowning class and a bunch of serfs that rented from them. And so the financialization of certain things that used to be, as you say, a crucial pathway into the middle class, I think is a very bad development. And a big part of the reason that happened is monetary policy. Monetary policy has made housing not only a very high internal rate of return asset class, because you can lever it, right? So you can get a very high IRR on your equity outlay, but it's also provided an enormous amount of very low cost capital to certain players in the private equity space or the money center banks or what have you. So I think that's a major problem.
Funny how housing is where a lot of this stuff comes together, right? Regulations limiting the building of new houses. So sort of the regulatory sort of regime contributes to it. The financialization contributes to it. Trade with China in a weird way contributes to it. I've heard more and more from friends living in Texas in particular that houses in the neighborhood being bought by China, by their representatives, essentially the Chinese government.
Totally.
This is obviously with American dollars. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, they got to deploy the capital, the financial capital that they have because of their trade surpluses, right?
Right. Yeah, and so it's a little bit, to say the least, worrying for those who care about thriving communities, human flourishing, civil society, to think about a world in which a significant percentage of our housing stock is owned by banks and China. That doesn't seem like a good future. But nobody is even talking about that, as far as I can tell. I mean, certainly, I haven't heard anybody talking about it. Do you know of any? I know you are, Tim, and I appreciate it. But do you know of any other legislators or would-be legislators who have sort of brought bills to bear on this sort of question, or introduced new better regulations?
That's a good question. I don't. Certainly, that doesn't mean that there aren't some, but I'm not aware of them.
Right. Yeah, the fact that we're not aware of them and somebody running for Congress isn't aware of them tells us, I think, all we need to know about the sort of the lack of alignment between what is really happening in this country and what people are talking about when it comes to legislation. Yeah. Okay, a couple more things I want to get your opinion on this middle class question. I know we're just sort of like parking on this question, but it's so important. Just two areas I'll just ask you to kind of riff on: college debt and healthcare costs, because those are the two things that you've brought up among other people.
Yeah, so
as real issues.
Yeah, there's this thing called the Peter Thiel graph, right? Peter Thiel was sort of criticized for this graph that he threw out there, and I think there were some people had some technical quibbles with it. Turns out he was right if you take his methodology and extend it in time. And what it shows is that the price of a college degree, college tuition, has increased by around 800% in the last 40 years. And then, the way I like to say this on the campaign trail is, meanwhile, headline wages for, those without a college degree have flatlined. And in some cases, in nominal terms, you don't even have to adjust for inflation. They're still flat.
Wow.
Like nominal, like headline wages. And so we're buying college degrees at 2022 sticker prices with 1982 wages. And so why is that? A very big part of the reason is the increasing array of services that these colleges and universities baked into the tuition bill, right? They're the gatekeepers, or a gatekeeper, into the middle class. They know it. And as a result, kind of this bureaucratic impulse to build empire kicks in. And they bundle all kinds of things, whether it's giant research departments, whether it's, spas and gyms, whether it's sports programs, you name it. The college experience has become extremely luxurious in some places and extremely expensive across the board. And so, what I say is let's apply some antitrust policy here, because we have this doctrine against tying or bundling in our antitrust laws, which basically says, look, there are cases where tying is anti-competitive. That's exactly what these colleges and universities are doing. So I say we ought to force public colleges and universities to separately price the classroom time that you need to get the credential from the rest of the services. And that would decrease the cost of a college degree by as much as 75%, and reopen this pathway into the middle class for millions of Americans who simply can't afford it now. And so fine, if you want to provide all these other services, you can. Just don't force people to buy them in order to get the thing that they need in order to prosper, which is the classroom. So that's one.
I wonder.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
That's a quick question about college. Because that's a very interesting idea. And again, it's another one I have never heard anybody articulate. And I on that one, I wonder, I think it would, even if you did it, I wonder if consumers would continue, because essentially what you're buying is a network, relationships, and not actually the content, especially, many of these public, as you know, universities, the courses you take are not exactly full of useful content. I think I'm not breaking any news there. Maybe they are in engineering and chemistry, but not in many other areas. I wonder if the value of the network wouldn't still be somewhat sustained and people would still choose the $200,000 price tag for the 4 years.
Oh, there's no doubt some would. But think about all of the folks who can't afford that, right? They'd just buy the classroom time, and that's great, right? So let them get the classroom time that is required for the credential. But yeah, no doubt. That's kind of why I say, let the university separately price these services, because some people would still demand.
We'll find out.
The full college experience. Yeah.
So healthcare. I'm sorry, I cut you off. I'd like to hear your thoughts on healthcare too.
Yeah. So I think the key thing with healthcare, and here too, for whatever reason, there seems to be very little discussion of this, is that there's no price formation. And I know that sounds like nerdy economist stuff, but here's what I mean. When you go to a hospital and let's say you get an appendix flares up, you get that thing pulled out. You get a bill, and let's say there's a $20,000 or $15,000 price tag on it. That's not a price. That's just a number. A price is something that reflects the underlying value of the resources that were required to produce the thing that you got. And so how do we know that that's not a price? Well, now we can test it. So I talk about this in my manuscript, the Oklahoma Surgery Center. There's several of these places, but the Oklahoma Surgery Center is probably the most well. So the Oklahoma Surgery Center is in Oklahoma, and they are a healthcare center. They provide all kinds of services, procedures. They take cash only. It's cash on the barrelhead. So there's no reimbursement, nothing, no insurance, cash on the barrelhead. And as a result, they have had, over the past 20 years, they have had to determine prices. They've had to think about, okay, well, gee, what does this machine cost? What are these disposables that I need for the surgery? What do those cost me? What about the doctor's time? What about the room or the lab? What is that capital outlay? And so they've formed prices the way that producers actually form prices, which hospitals do not. And so what you see is that for a very, very broad array of services, I think it's like 600. The price that the Oklahoma Surgery Center charges is around 25% of the invoice number. Now, I'm not going to call it a price that you get from a hospital.
Yeah.
And so people come from all over the world for that reason. And so what I say is, okay, one of the things we ought to do to reform healthcare, everywhere that we can observe a price, we should force hospitals and insurance companies to reimburse at that price. That should be what shows up on your invoice, because what's showing up on your invoice again is we know 3 to 4 times higher than a true market price for the service. And that's the beauty of a true market price. You know that the service will still be supplied at that price. So this wouldn't restrict supply. It would simply force rationality, because that's what prices really do. Is they impose a certain rationality. It would force a certain rationality into a system that has gone really kind of haywire. I mean, I've tried to study the healthcare system many times, and I can tell you the complexity. I talk about complexity as discrimination in my manuscript. The complexity of our healthcare system is mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. And the beauty of true market pricing is it just injects rationality into that system immediately. Now, we don't observe prices. Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy. Sorry.
Well, I was just saying I can hear the hosannas from here. I mean, it is maddeningly irrational, as everybody who's ever had to interface, which is all of us, with the healthcare system knows.
Yep, it is. It is indeed.
Sorry, I cut you off. You were going to make one more point, I think.
Nah, it was just an ancillary point. I should let you do some more talking here. Sorry.
Well, we're getting near our time, so let me just take us to. There's so much more we could talk about. I could talk to you about this stuff all day, because you actually have studied it. It's great to have a real economist on who's thoughtfully reflected on these items. Let me just pick out 2 things from your platform, which I think are interesting and different. I've never seen on anybody else's platform, just to have you talk about, and then we'll close with these. The first is the very first thing on part of your economy platform is personal data ownership. Tim Reichert believes that every man, woman, and child in the United States should own their data. What does that mean, and what would it do if that were the case?
Okay, so data at some level is the new oil, right? It's either the first or second most valuable commodity in the world, and people think of it as a privacy issue. I think of it as a property rights issue because you emit it by just walking around. And I argue that we need a digital Homestead Act. I mentioned before we started the show that we've had 6 Homestead Acts in this country, not one, but 6, right? The great historian Paul Johnson says no government in the history of mankind has done more to develop and foster and ennoble its people than the American federal government did through these Homestead Acts. So I argue for a digital Homestead Act whereby you own your data, and there are blockchain technologies that help facilitate this. So the technology exists to do this, but you would then be able to lease those data if you wanted to advertisers, to large corporations. So it would create an income stream, and actually a fairly sizable one. We did some analysis of this at my firm. We estimate around $3,000 to $5,000 per adult. So that's a big deal, right? A kind of, an enormous. It's a transfer of wealth. Like, let's be honest, it would decrease the value of these large technology companies, which is in my view, a beneficial outcome. Second, it would protect you. So these large technology companies know more about you than you know about you. I guarantee that's true. I mean, millions and millions of data points on every adult in this country. It would also protect you from large government agencies. I mean, we're moving toward a state corporate model that is itself moving toward, by state corporate model, I mean big government and big tech or big corporation, that is itself moving toward a kind of surveillance state. And I think that's very dangerous. So personal data ownership to me is a really important, policy objective.
Yeah, I think that strikes me as incredibly sensible and needed, and realistic when you talk about it, which is great. I always thought that might be the obstacle. Okay, one more thing. You've mentioned we talked about small business before and how sort of regulations are essentially a way to keep small businesses often from becoming large businesses and competing with large players in the sector. Small businesses are very much part of the fabric of civil society. There's in a way that large businesses often are not. I think it's fair to say. And certainly a key to kind of wide asset ownership is the widespread distribution of businesses. How could bring back up fair trade laws, which are sort of like forgotten now, it feels like to me? Or how could fair trade laws sort of be revived in a way that helps small businesses compete against the giants of Walmart?
Yeah, okay. So we built the middle class on the back of 4 industries: retail, construction, manufacturing, and I'm forgetting the other one, but I will remember it. But with regard to retail, we've moved into this sort of retail giantism. And most people don't realize this, but that happened in large part because one company, Walmart, went around and lobbied for the abolition, state by state, of what were called fair trade laws. So fair trade laws were laws that allowed, they didn't require, but I think in some cases, for some states, maybe it was required, but for the most part, they allowed manufacturers to set the price that retailers that sold their products would sell at. So the manufacturer would produce something, a toy, and tell the retailer, it would sell that product to the retailer, but it would say to the retailer, you're going to sell this for like $1. So the manufacturer was setting the retail price. And what that meant is that the retailers all sold at the same price. And the only way they could compete was on the basis of service. And that gave an inherent advantage to the little guy, the small local retailer. And it fostered civil society. It fostered Main Street. I think one of the biggest reasons, really 2 primary reasons we lost these main streets. Some people point to the interstate highway system. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but two primary reasons are we lost the fair trade laws and we lost our manufacturing base. And so I say, let's bring them back, right? I mean, we've had this 40-year experiment, 50-year experiment with giantism. Let's let the little guy compete on the basis of service. And yes, would it be slightly less efficient? Maybe. But economists have studied this. Not by very much is the answer. And furthermore, you're also producing civil society. You're producing relationships because of that service. That's so important. I mean, that just seems like smart economic policy that would promote human flourishing.
Amen. Well, we'll leave it at that. I've kept you longer than I promised I would keep you. I appreciate your time. I know you're very busy. You have a whole, not only a company, but a campaign to run. Tim Reichert, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed this, Jeremy. Thank you.
I did too, very much so. Could talk to you for much longer. If you want to follow Tim, get involved at all, and just learn more about him and his campaign, go to reichertforcongress.com. And again, Tim, thanks so much. Good luck to you, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate your time.